Commander Vexus walked through the long corridors of the Krell command station with heavy steps. His armor was scarred from countless battles, and his 3 eyes carried the weight of 7 long years of warfare. The news had spread quickly through the military ranks that he was returning from the human frontier, and everyone wanted to hear what he had learned, not theories or calculations or data from distant observers, but real accounts from someone who had actually fought against them. The council chamber was already filled when Vexus arrived. Representatives from every major species in the Dominion sat around the massive black table. Their faces turned toward the door as he entered. The Zorvith chairman gestured for Vexus to take the speaking platform, and the commander moved forward with the careful deliberation of a soldier who had seen too much. Around the table sat species from across the galaxy, the crystalline Zorvets, with their transparent skin that glowed softly with internal light. The tall, thin Trilaxians with their long antennae that could sense emotions in the air. The insectoid Krell with their compound eyes that never blinked, and many others. Each one convinced of their own superiority, each one certain that no species could stand against the combined might of the Krell Dominion for more than a century. The Dominion had expanded across the galaxy. Unopposed, they had conquered dozens of civilizations. Some fell through military force. Others surrendered when they saw the futility of resistance. The Dominion had become arrogant in their power, convinced that their technology was unbeatable, their strategy unmatched. But then they encountered humanity. The humans came from a small blue planet at the edge of known space, a world so unremarkable that scouts had passed by it twice without noting anything significant. When the Dominion finally sent a proper survey team, they found a species that was still learning to leave their home world. No advanced weapons, no ancient technology, no mysterious power, just humans with primitive spaceships and determined eyes. The first contact had been a disaster. The Dominion commander had expected immediate surrender when they showed the humans the power of their weapons. Instead, the humans had attacked, not with any hope of victory, but simply because they refused to submit. They had fought, and they had died. And somehow in their dying they had damaged 3 Dominion warships. It was impossible, yet it had happened now. 7 years later, the war had become something that nobody in the Dominion had expected. The humans had not surrendered. In fact, they had grown stronger, fiercer, more dangerous with each passing cycle. The Dominion controlled more territory than ever. But they controlled nothing permanently. The humans fought from shadows and deserts and mountains. They struck supply lines and communication centers. They vanished when faced with overwhelming force and appeared again in places the Dominion thought secure. The council chairman finally spoke. He was ancient by Zorva standards, his crystalline form showing cracks from centuries of life. His voice was patient but firm as he addressed Vexus. "Tell us what you have discovered, Commander. Tell us why a species so primitive continues to resist, despite all logic suggesting they should have been eliminated years ago." Vexus took a long breath before beginning. His translator processed his natural clicks and chirps into understandable speech. "Council members, I have returned from the human frontier, not with simple casualty reports or strategic assessments. I have returned with something more valuable: understanding. I have fought against humans in 17 major engagements. I have lost soldiers. I trained for years. I have seen military victories become hollow when I discovered their cost." He walked slowly along the edge of the table, making sure each council member could see his battle-scarred armor, his damaged uniform, the weapons marks across his frame. "I arrived at the frontier believing the human resistance was simply a cultural tendency toward stubbornness, a refusal to accept the inevitable, combined with an inability to understand advanced concepts. I assumed victory would come through patient attrition, that eventually humans would simply run out of soldiers and surrender. But what I discovered was far more disturbing. Humans are not simply stubborn. They are something else entirely. They are adaptable in ways that our military theory has never encountered. They can take our strengths and turn them into weaknesses. They can see solutions where we see only impossible situations. And most terrifying of all, they are willing to die for abstract concepts like honor and freedom in ways that seem irrational until you understand the human mind. The Tralaxian representative leaned forward, his antennae quivering with skepticism. They lack our technology by several levels of advancement. How can they possibly threaten the Dominion? The humans should be dying by thousands against our superior weaponry. They do die by thousands, Vexus replied, but they die on their own terms, not ours. And for every human we kill, we find ourselves losing soldiers at rates that are unsustainable. More importantly, we find ourselves losing the will to continue fighting in certain ways because humans have shown us that simple military force is not enough. They have demonstrated strategies that should be impossible, tactics that run counter to everything we understand about efficient warfare. Vexus moved to the center of the chamber. I have come to share 3 specific accounts with you, 3 incidents that will explain why I believe we must fundamentally reconsider our approach to this conflict. The first involves a canyon and a human commander named Robert, a young man with no formal military training before this war, and yet he commanded a strategy that trapped and decimated a force superior to his own. The second involves a woman named Victoria, who was running a medical station and faced the choice between saving herself and protecting those who could not protect themselves. When Victoria could have escaped with her life, she chose to fight. She chose to die. And in that death, she killed more soldiers than she could have saved by abandoning her post. The mathematics were impossible, yet they happened. The third account concerns an officer named Marcus who achieved something even more disturbing. He lost. And yet he won. He was defeated in every tactical measure. And yet his failure accomplished exactly what victory would have. The council chamber had become quiet. The weight of Vexus's words hung in the air like something physical. He could see doubt in the expressions around the table. And he had not even begun to tell the actual stories yet. He had simply set the stage for what was to come. I will now tell you exactly what happened in each of these 3 encounters. Vexus said quietly, I will explain how humans think differently than we do. How they see warfare not as the simple application of force, but as something far more complex. After you hear these accounts, you will understand why I believe we must begin to fear not human technology or human strength. We must fear human creativity, human determination, and human willingness to sacrifice everything for their ideals. That is what I have learned from fighting them. That is what I have come to tell you. The chairman nodded slowly, his crystalline form catching the light as he moved. Proceed. Commander, tell us about the canyon and Robert. Tell us about the humans who refused to die when they should. The canyon they called Meridian Pass stretched across the human-controlled territory like a scar in the earth. Commander Vexus had studied the surveillance data before the operation began, and everything seemed perfectly clear. 3,000 human soldiers defending a narrow valley with limited escape routes and nowhere to hide from aerial bombardment. Against them, Vexus commanded 2,000 of the finest Krell warriors ever trained, elite soldiers with advanced armor, weapon systems far superior to anything the humans possessed, and the confidence that comes from 7 years of dominance in space warfare. The plan was simple and had worked countless times before. The Krell forces would advance through the canyon in a disciplined formation, using their superior firepower to eliminate the human defenses. The humans would either retreat or die. Both options favored the Dominion. Vexus had calculated the engagement strategy himself, and by all mathematical models, the humans should have been wiped out in less than 3 hours. The advance began at first light, with the massive Krell soldiers moving forward in perfect formation. Their heavy combat boots thundered against the canyon floor, echoing off the walls. Above them, Krell air support circled, weapons armed and ready. Cameras mounted on the canyon walls showed no sign of human resistance, just an empty canyon and the promise of swift victory. For the first hour, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The Krell column moved deeper into the pass, their numbers growing more concentrated as the canyon walls pressed closer on either side. Vexus observed from an elevated position, watching the tactical displays with the calm certainty of a military commander executing a perfect strategy. Intelligence had suggested the humans might put up some resistance, but nothing had prepared him for what actually happened. The explosions came without warning, not from human weapon systems, but from the canyon walls themselves. Shaped charges detonated in carefully calculated sequences, sending avalanches of massive stone tumbling down onto the canyon floor. But they were not aimed at killing. They were aimed at blocking, trapping, separating. Vexus realized what was happening in the moment it took him to process the data. Robert had turned the canyon into a maze. The Krell column, stretched thin and committed, suddenly found itself isolated in segments. Those at the front could not advance far without encountering secondary collapses. Those at the rear could not retreat because Robert's forces had already moved to seal those exits. The Krell soldiers, who had been moving in disciplined formation, were suddenly broken into smaller groups unable to communicate with each other. Robert himself appeared on the tactical feeds, moving with his soldiers through positions the humans had prepared long before any Krell force had entered the canyon. He was young, probably no older than 30 cycles in human reckoning, with the kind of calm in his voice that suggested he had done this exact thing many times before. His soldiers listened to his commands with complete faith, moving with the kind of synchronization that Vexus had only seen in fully trained military units. The humans then did something that contradicted every principle of military engagement that Vexus understood. They did not attack the entire Krell force at once. Instead, they chose to engage one isolated segment at a time. They attacked the smallest groups with overwhelming force, then retreated before the Krell could regroup and call for support. They created chaos instead of seeking direct confrontation. They made every Krell victory hollow by ensuring that victory came at impossible cost. The Krell soldiers fought with all the skill and determination they possessed, but they were fighting in Robert's canyon on Robert's terms. When one section tried to push forward, more stone came down. When another section tried to retreat, human soldiers appeared from positions in the rocks above. Robert seemed to be everywhere at once, always appearing where he was needed, always knowing what the Krell would attempt before they attempted it. Vexus watched in horror as the casualty reports streamed in. Krell soldiers fell by the hundreds. Young soldiers, experienced soldiers, elite soldiers trained from birth for combat. They fell to human weapons, to falling stone, to the simple mathematics of isolation and superior positioning. And the humans fell too, but in far smaller numbers. After 12 hours of fighting, Vexus made the decision to withdraw. He had lost 800 soldiers, possibly more. The humans had lost 47. The mathematics were undeniable. Continuing would mean the death of his entire force in a canyon where Robert could dictate every term of engagement. The commander gave the order to retreat, and the surviving Krell soldiers moved backward through the passes Robert allowed them to use. As they evacuated, Robert did not pursue. He did not need to. He had already won something far more valuable than a military victory. He had proven to the Dominion that superior firepower meant nothing if you could not use it. He had shown that a smaller force with better understanding of terrain and situation could defeat a larger force of better-equipped soldiers standing before the council. Vexus described every detail of that canyon. He explained Robert's strategy with the kind of precision that only someone who had lived through it could provide. He showed them the calculations of how a young human, with no formal military training, had managed to defeat one of the most experienced commanders in the Krell. Military 1 of the Trilaxian. Council members asked the obvious question. Why did the humans not simply collapse the entire canyon and bury the Krell forces completely? Vexus had asked himself that question many times. Robert's answer, captured in communication intercepts before the final evacuation, explained everything. He had said that his goal was not to kill as many Krell as possible. His goal was to teach them a lesson that could not be unlearned, a lesson about the danger of assumptions, about the power of strategy over strength, about the reality that wars were not won by the side with the biggest weapons, but by the side with the clearest understanding of how to use them in that canyon. Robert had achieved something remarkable. He had not simply won a battle. He had changed how Vexus understood warfare itself. For the first time, the Krell commander understood that the humans were not fighting the same war the Dominion was fighting. The humans understood something about combat that advanced military schools had apparently never taught. The Krell, victory was not always about domination. Sometimes it was about control, positioning, understanding your enemy's mind well enough to predict and counter every move they would make. The council listened in absolute silence as Vexus finished his account of the canyon. They could see in his scarred armor, in his careful words, in the haunted look in his 3 eyes, that this experience had fundamentally changed something in the veteran commander. He had gone into the canyon certain of Krell superiority. He had come out understanding that superiority meant nothing when facing an opponent who thought differently. An opponent who saw possibilities where the Krell saw only obstacles. An opponent willing to sacrifice some to achieve something greater. The medical station orbited a small colony world that the humans had established 3 years before the war began. Victoria Chun commanded the facility, though she had never expected to command anything more than a hospital staff. She was a doctor by training. Someone who had spent her life learning how to save people, not how to fight. The war has a way of changing people, of placing them in situations that force them to become more than they ever imagined. Intelligence had located the station purely by accident. A Krell patrol discovered its location while sweeping the sector for human military assets. What they found was not a military installation, but a medical facility. 2,000 wounded soldiers recovering from injuries, 300 civilians from the nearby colony, and 200 medical personnel who knew nothing about combat. To the Krell commander overseeing the sector, it seemed like an easy victory, a chance to eliminate a position with no meaningful resistance. But Vexus learned that Victoria had a different understanding of what an easy victory meant. She could have evacuated everyone and saved lives. The medical station had transport ships, escape pods, and the coordinates of safe zones outside Krell territory. A rational commander would have abandoned the facility and ensured the survival of as many people as possible. Victoria chose differently. She sent the evacuation ships away with the civilians and most of the walking wounded. But she remained behind with 2,000 people who could not travel. The severely injured, the post-surgical patients, the people so damaged by war that moving them would certainly kill them. She remained with them, knowing what was coming, knowing that the Krell would show no mercy to those they found. When the Krell assault force arrived, Victoria was ready. She had transformed the medical station into a fortification, using the very equipment designed to heal. Surgical equipment became weapons. Medical supplies became defensive tools. She had read military manuals, studied basic tactics, and done everything possible to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. Her soldiers were not trained. Most had been orderlies or technicians or administrative staff, but they believed in Victoria, and they followed her orders with the kind of devotion that confused. Krell observers who were trained to see hierarchy and command structure as the only source of military discipline. The assault began at dawn. 200 Krell soldiers against 200 medical personnel with improvised weapons and no formal training. By every calculation, the outcome was predetermined. The Krell forces should have overwhelmed the defenders in minutes. Instead, the battle lasted 8 hours, and it should have lasted longer. Victoria fought with the kind of desperate courage that Vexis had rarely witnessed. She was not a soldier, but she acted like someone who had been born to command. She made split-second decisions about where to position her people, how to use the limited defensive positions available, when to retreat to secondary and tertiary fortifications. She moved through the station constantly, encouraging her soldiers, filling gaps in the defense, sometimes fighting directly against the Krell warriors despite having no formal combat training. The Krell soldiers found themselves facing something unexpected, not military resistance, which they were trained to handle, but human desperation combined with human ingenuity. Victoria's people used their knowledge of the station's layout to create ambush. They understood which passages were narrow enough to negate the Krell size advantage. They understood which electrical systems could be overloaded to create explosions. They understood that they were not fighting to win, but fighting to buy time for more evacuation ships to escape. Every time the Krell advanced, Victoria's defenders retreated to the next defensive position. Every retreat was calculated. Every choke point was prepared. Every position was defended with the understanding that retreat meant the Krell got closer to the wounded they had left behind. Victoria herself spent most of the battle in the lower sections of the facility, where the most severely injured were located. She moved patients when she could, comforted them when she could not, and ensured that if the Krell reached those sections, they would have to go through her first. As the battle progressed, Victoria was struck by enemy fire. Once, twice, 3 times. Krell weapons designed for military armor tore through her uniform and damaged her internally. She should have sought medical attention, or at least retreated from active combat. Instead, she continued fighting Vexis, watching the tactical data from the Krell command center. Could not understand it. The humans called this pain tolerance, courage, or dedication to mission. The Krell called it irrationality. The final breach came in the afternoon, when Victoria's defenders could no longer maintain the forward defensive line. The Krell had used their superior numbers and firepower to slowly push deeper into the station. Victoria gathered the remaining 30 soldiers around her and made a final stand in the main corridor leading to the lowest sections where the most critical patients remained. There, with weapons in hands that had never been trained to hold them, with armor that was never meant for combat, with nothing but determination and the knowledge that they were protecting defenseless people. Victoria's remaining soldiers fought for every meter of space. They fought knowing they would lose. Vexis knew it. The Krell soldiers knew it, and Victoria knew it. When the medical station's power core overloaded, whether by design or accident, the entire lower section collapsed. The explosion killed 43 Krell soldiers instantly. Victoria died with them, along with her remaining defenders. But the collapse gave the final evacuation ships time to escape with more civilians, more wounded, more of the colony's future. The mathematical outcome was devastating for the Krell. Analysis: a single doctor who had never received combat training, working with medical personnel who had never fired weapons before this war, had killed far more Krell soldiers than she would have saved people by evacuating. From a pure strategic standpoint, she should have abandoned the facility immediately. Yet her choice had accomplished something more valuable than any strategic calculation could measure. She had shown the galaxy that humans would choose to die defending others over choosing life for themselves. She had demonstrated that some values mattered more to humans than survival. She had created a moment that would inspire human resistance for years to come. Soldiers in other sectors would hear about Victoria and fight harder. Civilians would hear about Victoria and refuse to surrender. Vexis explained to the council that this was the moment he began to understand something fundamental about humans. They were not fighting for territory or resources or galactic dominance. They were fighting for something abstract that the Krell barely understood. They were fighting for the right to choose their own fate, to decide for themselves what was worth dying for, and that, Vexus explained quietly, made them far more dangerous than any military analysis had predicted, because a species willing to die for abstract principles could never be fully defeated. You could kill them by the millions, and they would still resist. You could destroy their worlds, and they would still fight. Only if you could destroy the principles themselves could you truly win, and that was something Vexus was not convinced could be done. Marcus Harrison was a young human officer who commanded a garrison in the northern sector of the colony world. When the Krell forces surrounded his position 3 cycles into the campaign, it became clear that rescue was impossible. His garrison was isolated, cut off from reinforcements, trapped in a fortified facility that could not be evacuated without abandoning the supply depot that served 3 other human strongholds. The choice before Marcus was simple: surrender or die, defending an indefensible position. The Krell general commanding the siege was confident in his victory. He had surrounded the garrison with forces that outnumbered the defenders 3-1. He controlled the high ground around the fortification. He had air support and heavy weapons that the humans could not match. He had sent a message to Marcus, offering simple terms: surrender within 1 cycle or face complete annihilation. Marcus received the message in the command center of his garrison, surrounded by 200 soldiers who looked at him waiting for his decision. They were all relatively young. Most had never seen combat before this war began. Many had families in the colony who depended on their survival by any logical measure. They should have surrendered. The Krell would accept their surrender, likely imprison them, and eventually they might be exchanged for captured Krell soldiers. Instead, Marcus did something that Vexus still struggled to fully understand. He ordered an immediate counteroffensive. The Krell general, who received the information about the human attack, responded with amusement. The humans were launching an offensive from a surrounded position against an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. It was tactically absurd. It was strategically nonsensical. It was the action of a commander who did not understand basic military mathematics. But Marcus was not trying to win through mathematics. He was trying to win through chaos. The human assault began before dawn, striking 5 different points on the siege perimeter simultaneously. Each attack was designed not to break through the Krell lines, but to cause maximum disruption. Supply convoys were targeted and destroyed. Communication arrays were DAMAGE. Defensive positions were attacked not to capture them but to force the Krell to respond, to reorganize, to lose the careful coordination they had established during the siege. The Krell commander found himself facing a situation he had not anticipated. The siege was no longer about waiting for the humans to starve or surrender. It had become a chaotic engagement on multiple fronts. The human garrison was no longer behaving like a trapped force, accepting inevitable defeat. They were behaving like soldiers, attacking an enemy position. Vexus described to the council how the tactical situation had shifted moment by moment. The Krell forces, which had seemed firmly in control 1 cycle earlier, suddenly found themselves dealing with constant attacks from unexpected directions. When they moved forces to counter one attack, human soldiers appeared at a different location. When they concentrated their strength to eliminate a threat, that threat disappeared and reappeared somewhere else. Marcus had transformed the siege into a war of movement and constant crisis. The most remarkable aspect of Marcus's strategy was what it cost. Human casualties climbed steadily as the counteroffensive continued. The humans were not actually winning tactical engagements. They were losing almost every direct confrontation with Krell forces. But they were winning something more important than individual battles. They were winning the psychological and strategic initiative. They had convinced the Krell commander that his situation was deteriorating when in fact he still held every military advantage. after 14 hours of continuous assault and response. The Krell commander made his decision. He ordered a withdrawal, not because his forces were in serious danger, but because the siege situation had become untenable. The careful coordination of the siege was shattered. Supply lines were disrupted. The human garrison, rather than being a trapped force awaiting elimination, had become an active threat, generating constant crises that required constant response. The commander reasoned that it was more efficient to withdraw, regroup, and approach the problem differently than to continue a siege that was no longer functioning as intended by any rational military calculation. His decision made sense. The situation had become costly and unstable, and withdrawing to establish a more controlled position seemed prudent. Marcus had won not through military victory, but through psychological impact he had made continuing the siege seem impossible, even though it was theoretically still viable. He had made the Krell commander choose to abandon a position of advantage because that advantage had become complicated by human unpredictability. Vexus explained to the council that this was the third example that had finally changed his understanding of human warfare. Robert had shown him that terrain and preparation could defeat superior force. Victoria had shown him that humans would choose death, defending others, but Marcus taught him something even more disturbing. Humans could win without winning. They could achieve victory by making victory seem impossible or too expensive to pursue. One of the council members asked why the Vice Krell commander had not simply held his position with superior numbers and firepower. Why retreat in the face of a desperate attack from a surrounded garrison? The answer, Vexus said quietly, was that the commander was thinking in traditional military terms. He was calculating costs and benefits, efficiency and resources. But he was operating from the assumption that military advantages were permanent and that the situation could be controlled through superior force. Marcus had proven that assumption wrong by creating enough chaos and disruption, by forcing enough constant crises, by making the simple act of continuing the siege an exhausting series of problems rather than a simple waiting game. Marcus had broken the commander's confidence in his position. This was something the Krell had not yet learned to defend against, because it was not really a military tactic at all. It was a psychological one. It relied on the enemy's own rational thought processes being turned against them. A rational commander, faced with increasing costs and decreasing certainty of eventual success, makes the rational decision to withdraw. Humans had weaponized rational thinking itself, turning the very logic that the Krell relied upon into a tool of defeat. Vexus stood before the council with his scarred armor and his haunted eyes and explained that this realization had been the most troubling of all, because it meant that the Krell could not simply increase force or invest more resources or wait out the human resistance. Any of those approaches would simply play into human hands. The humans understood that expensive victories were still defeats, that military advantage was meaningless if it became impossible to actually use, that the appearance of control mattered more than actual control in warfare. Marcus had lost the siege war, but won the larger conflict by forcing the Krell to abandon a position of apparent strength. And that victory, achieved not through superior force or technology, but through superior understanding of human psychology and strategy, was perhaps the most terrifying example of all that Vexus had come to witness. The chamber had grown cold as Vexus finished his 3 accounts. The council members sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of everything they had heard. Outside the windows, the artificial lights of the Krell command station continued their endless cycle. Indifferent to the crisis of confidence that was spreading through the leadership of the Dominion, Vexus remained standing at the speaking platform, his scarred figure a living reminder of the truths he had revealed. He waited for the questions he knew would come, the objections, the attempts to rationalize what seemed irrational about human behavior. But before any council member could speak, The commander continued with the conclusions he had drawn from his time on the human frontier. The mistake the Dominion had made from the beginning was simple. Vexus said, his voice steady and clear. We assumed that advanced technology equals military superiority. We believed that superior weapons meant superior soldiers. We thought that greater firepower meant guaranteed victory. But the humans have taught me that all of these assumptions are only partial truths. They are incomplete pictures of how warfare actually functions. He moved along the council table, making sure each member could see the determination in his eyes. I have spent the last 7 years trying to understand why we are losing a war we should have won easily. I have studied human tactics, analyzed their strategies, and observed how they think about conflict. What I have discovered is that humans approach warfare from a completely different foundation than the Krell does. Trilaxian representative raised one of his delicate hands, his antennae drooping in what might have been confusion or concern. Commander, are you suggesting that we cannot win this war? That the Krell Dominion should surrender to these primitives? No. Vexus replied simply, I am suggesting that we can win this war. But the cost of winning will be far higher than we currently accept. And I am suggesting that the price of victory might be higher than the value of what we would actually gain. He allowed that statement to sink in before continuing. Consider the mathematics of this war so far. We have deployed more than 300,000 soldiers across the human territory. We have lost 17,000 soldiers killed and another 30,000 wounded in ways that ended their military service. In the same period, humans have lost approximately 20,000 soldiers. The Zorvath chairman interrupted. Then we are actually winning. Our losses represent 5% of deployed force. The human losses represent their entire available military strength. That is the argument that commanders have been making for 7 years. Vexus acknowledged, and it is based on old thinking, old understandings of what victory means. I ask you to think differently. Yes, our losses are a smaller percentage of our military force, but we cannot replace 30,000 soldiers instantly. We cannot reassign wounded soldiers back to frontline service. We cannot pretend that morale remains unchanged when soldiers witness the tactics humans use to neutralize our advantages. He pointed to a data screen behind him showing casualty rates. When we calculate the true cost of this war, we must include wounded soldiers who cannot fight. Soldiers who have psychological reactions to human behavior that reduce their effectiveness. Soldiers who require years of training to reach combat readiness. The Dominion has invested enormous resources into this war, and the return on that investment grows worse with every cycle. A young Krell council member, someone who had not yet experienced warfare firsthand, leaned forward with sharp movements. What you are describing, Commander, sounds like surrender. The Dominion does not surrender. We have never negotiated with species we could eventually defeat. Vexus nodded slowly. That is precisely the thinking that concerns me. We have never encountered a species like humans before. We have never faced an opponent who could turn our strengths into weaknesses, who could make our military advantages mean less than they should. But the humans are forcing us to reconsider what defeating them actually means. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Consider this question. If we eventually eliminate all human military forces, but we lose 50,000 soldiers in the process, if we occupy their territory, but they continue to resist through insurgency and rebellion for decades. If we murder millions of humans, but they inspire millions more to take their place, have we actually won? Or have we simply created a permanent wound in the Dominion that will drain our resources forever? The chamber remained silent. The question Vexus posed was one that no one wanted to ask, let alone answer. The Dominion had built its power on the assumption that military force could solve any problem. That superior strength always led to victory. That conquest meant submission. I have come to recommend something that may seem impossible. Vexus said quietly, I recommend we begin negotiation with the human leadership, not because we cannot win this war, but because we have come to understand what winning actually costs, not because the humans are superior, but because they are different in ways that make them dangerous to anyone who underestimates them. The Trilaxian representative made a sound of disapproval. Negotiate with primitives. That would demonstrate weakness to the rest of the galaxy. Would it? Vexus asked. Or would it demonstrate the kind of wisdom that real strength allows? The Dominion does not need to prove our superiority by destroying the humans. The galaxy already knows our power. What they do not yet understand is whether we are wise enough to use that power intelligently. He looked directly at the Zorith chairman. I have fought these humans for 7 years. I have seen them at their worst and most terrible, and I have come to respect them in a way I did not believe possible. They are not cruel merely for the sake of cruelty. They are not driven by conquest and domination. They fight because they believe some things matter more than survival. They sacrifice for each other in ways that seem wasteful until you understand the strength that creates. The commander straightened, and for a moment he looked like a soldier again, rather than a messenger of uncomfortable truths. Victoria chose to die protecting those who could not protect themselves. Robert chose to teach a lesson rather than simply achieve victory. Marcus chose to make winning too expensive rather than surrender to superior force. These choices do not make sense in our context, but they make perfect sense in theirs. And that is exactly what makes them so formidable. If we continue this war, we will eventually achieve military victory, Vexus concluded. But we will not achieve the submission of the human species. We will not break their will to resist. We will not convince them that their principles are less important than their lives. And we will be forced to maintain occupation and control for generations at enormous cost. Alternatively, we can negotiate. We could establish boundaries, establish territories, establish rules of engagement that acknowledge the reality of human determination. We could create something other than victory or defeat. We could create coexistence. The council members exchanged looks, uncertain how to respond to a commander who had brought them military reports, but was now offering something far different. Fear, perhaps, or uncertainty, or the first glimmers of understanding that the world had changed in ways they had not yet fully grasped. Vexus walked toward the chamber doors, his mission of speaking complete. What happens next is not my decision, he said as he reached the exit. I have told you what I learned. I have explained what I understand about human nature and human warfare. You will decide whether to continue this war or to seek another path. But know this, whatever decision you make, the humans will face it as they face all things, with determination, with sacrifice, and with the belief that some things matter more than survival. The doors opened, and Commander Vexus left the council chamber, leaving behind 7 council members who now understood that the Krell Dominion had encountered an enemy they did not know how to defeat. Not through military strategy or firepower or technological superiority, but through a fundamental difference in how humans understood the meaning of victory and what made life worth living.